an Unspoiled Network podcast.
This is Spoil Me, covering Ruin and Rising, chapters 9, 10, and 11. In these chapters, we find out who VOLCRA is, and we see something happen to Nikolai that I'm deeply hoping is reversible. Welcome to Spoil Me. Welcome to the show, everyone. I am Natasha. Thank you very much to Joanna for commissioning this episode. Hi, Joanna, if you're out there. So, oh my god, you guys, these were some packed chapters. I'm actually pretty glad that I shorted myself a chapter on the last episode. I don't even know that I shorted myself, but I said that I covered 9, and I realized in the episode that I hadn't. And it was a pretty high-impact chapter, and it would have been difficult to fit everything in to talk about. So, I think it was for the best. Alright, so I'm going to really try and stay on track here because there is a lot to talk about here. So chapter 9 starts off with the visit that Alina pays to the Darkling. And this is just... I really, really appreciate that it comes down to, first of all, her being like, I am drawn to him, but I simply can't forget all the shit that he's done, because thank God. It's one of those things that I find really difficult personally, because I don't think that I have ever been attracted to someone who is also a bad person. I've been in toxic relationships, but they weren't bad people. It was just like we were not good for each other and fed off each other in ways that were like unhealthy. I personally find that when I find out somebody has done something that is maybe like objectively morally wrong, I don't feel a physical attraction to them the same way anymore. It just sours for me. It's just different and gone. So it's always very difficult for me to relate to characters. Like, it's one thing to be sort of into a bad boy in the way that we mean it when we talk about it as women. Usually we are saying like just guys who push the envelope, who maybe aren't always as respectful as we like in an ideal world would want. But there is something about their swagger that gets our attention. You know, the kind of thing where it's like they're breaking rules that I think I have, but I like it when they do it. That's one thing. And then there's another thing, which is just he's a bad man. And that's not being a bad boy. That's just being a fucking, like, murderer creep. And it has been really difficult for me because I thought, and I think I even said in the last section or the one before, that I was relieved Alina's, like, attraction to the Darkling seemed to have gone away. Then this happened. And I was sort of like, maybe it hasn't. Finally, she pushes away from him and is just like, absolutely fucking not. But it takes a minute. They kiss for a second before she even does that. And I was like, girl, what are you even doing? Come on. And I don't know if it's just like, I haven't been in the position where I have nobody else who relates to something huge about me other than this one person. And maybe that's all it is with Alina. You know, she is a sun summoner. She has an ability that literally nobody else has. Nobody can relate to it except for the Darkling. But that's just a little bit weak sauce for me at this point. You know, it's just not really doing it. So later on, after she finds out who VOLCRA is, she starts wondering if perhaps she is also a descendant of the same line and therefore related to the Darkling. And this adds a layer of grossness to the whole interaction for her, because she's like, oh my God, I just like made out with my cousin, maybe brother, even maybe, like not really, but you know. And a part of me is like relieved because I needed there to be something that would really drive it home. Like, nah, don't stop, come back. But I am also bummed that it has to be that. It's an external, like, societal taboo that keeps her from, it's not just about him, it doesn't feel like. And I'm a little bit disappointed in that, personally, you know. I don't know. I'd be interested to hear from you guys if y'all have been, like, attracted to a person who was otherwise bad and you knew they were for sure. You had seen them yourself do awful things and you just were able to get past it for some reason, because I just don't see it. It's one thing to not be certain and be in denial and lie to yourself. But if you are actively a witness multiple times, I just don't know how you, like, get past it. So this is when he, like, after she rejects him here and pushes him away. Oh, and he tells her his real name, Alexander. And she's a little amused at the fact that it's, like, a really ordinary name. She pushes him away, and he says, I grow weary of this game. And I'm like, same. And she says, weary, you've toyed with me at every turn. You haven't tired of the game. You're just sorry I'm not so easily played. And he's like, all right, you want to do this? Then let's do this. I have figured out a way to enter the fold and do some shit because your friend David has left some interesting notes behind that have turned out to be pretty useful to me. When I have crushed Lansov's only ally, I will hunt you like an animal. You will find no sanctuary. You will have no peace. And that is the end of their conversation. And it's just, you know, another, like, about face of him just, you know, being really, like, affectionate isn't quite the right word because that implies that there is some, like, genuine love there. But it's, they were very physical with each other. And he was, like, wanting her to let him. And then he just immediately turns around and it's like, oh, I'm going to kill you. And I'm definitely, like, going to torture you probably too. So get ready for that. And I was like, man, you are just such trash. So she goes and wakes up David. It's a big fucking procession, too. She can't just go to his room by herself. She has to go to his room, get some guards, get some other people, Mal and whatnot, come with her. Genya's in David's room, so they have to wake her up, too, and have this big fucking hullabaloo. And she's, like, asking him, because, like, at first, there's an implication of maybe David left his notes on purpose. What if David actually betrayed us? And I was just like, it didn't even... I did not entertain that theory for a moment. Of course David didn't betray you. Are you kidding me? It wasn't even so much about, like, I think David is so loyal. It was more for me, just the, like, logic of it didn't make sense. He wouldn't have betrayed you in such a way. It wouldn't work that way. Like, David is a very intelligent man. He is in pursuit of knowledge at all times, and that can be really dangerous. I mean... That's part of what science runs into a lot, I think, is the discovery of things for the sake of it, just because people are truly curious and want to know more, and it leads to the creation of, like, horrific weapons and stuff, because they aren't thinking about it in that way necessarily when they do their experiments and their exploration of things. But they fail to think about capitalism and how somebody's going to make use of what they have discovered. So for me, it just was a foregone conclusion. Of course, that wasn't what happened. He didn't betray you. However, it's really awkward because everybody wants to know, as she's, like, pushing him, okay, but Alina, where the fuck did you get your information? And she's just like, sources. I got it from sources. I'm like, bitch. I understand her urgency here and wanting to just go to David and find out what the fuck right away. But also, I desperately wanted her to come up with, like, a story. She winds up telling Nikolai the truth, which I was surprised by. She just tells him about the whole thing with the Darkling. And to his eternal credit, it makes everything that happens with Nikolai later so much more saddening. But to his eternal credit, Nikolai's reaction to her telling him this is immediately like, word? Oh my God, we could do so much shit with that. And I'm like, thank you. Yes. But no, because what happens, happens. So she pushes David, and finally he admits there was a plan for a glass skiff that Nikolai and I came up with, made to hold the Lumia, a variation on liquid fire. Oh, David, you didn't. Liquid fire was one of Morozsova's creations. It was sticky, flammable, and created a blaze that was almost impossible to extinguish. It was so dangerous that Morozsova had destroyed the formula only hours after he'd created it. So basically, napalm. No! David held his hands up defensively. No, this is safer, better. The reaction only creates light, not heat. I came up with it when we were trying to find ways to improve the flash bombs for fighting the Nichevoya. It wasn't applicable, but I liked the idea, so I kept it for later. It burns without heat? It's just a source of artificial sunlight. Enough to keep the VOLCRA at bay? Yes, but it's useless to the Darkling. It has a limited burn life, and you need sunlight to activate it. Would it be enough to hold off the VOLCRA? Asked Genya. No, I said. I don't think so. I'd needed an amplifier before I was able to command enough light to safely enter the fold. Of course, there was no guarantee that the Darkling hadn't taken more of my power when we'd faced each other in the chapel. And yet, if he'd been able to truly wield light, he would have acted before this. It doesn't matter, said David miserably. He only needs enough sunlight to activate the Lumia once he's in the fold. And they begin talking about the Nichevoya and the VOLCRA, and that maybe he can use the shadow soldiers to fight the VOLCRA back. I love Tamar saying, "Saints, who do you root for?" It's like the Alien versus Predator. No matter who wins, we lose. The problem was always containment, said David. Lumia eat through everything. The only thing that worked was glass, but that presents its own engineering problems. Nikolai and I never resolved them. It was just for fun. Oh, God. I feel so bad for David because he truly is just like, he's like a child, you know? He just wants to know. He just wants to find out. And he just, leaving everything behind like that, it would have been very helpful if they had had the time to douse his entire laboratory and put it up in flames. So that ends chapter 9, on to chapter 10. And this is when Nikolai comes to her and asks her where she got this information, and she tells him about the way she can visit him. We could try to probe for information, maybe even feed him false intelligence. Can you do this with other Grisha? Maybe try to get in their heads? And he even, the whole way that this works in his head, I just really appreciated it because Nikolai and I have a lot in common in the way that we approach things, and this is how I also think. I want to know the logistics around how something works. I want to spitball about potential other ideas. That's part of what I enjoy about covering things for the show, is also just coming up with wild theories. And sometimes it's annoying because I will evidently in my 10 minutes of talking about something have apparently put more thought into it than the actual writer has. But not always. Sometimes I'll be like, oh, wouldn't it be crazy if this thing were true? And then it turns out that they thought of that and they did that thing. And I'm like, oh, sweet. So let's see. She says, it's about isolating us, making sure we don't have anywhere to turn. He wants to use the fold. He always has. It's a compulsion. What kind of numbers can you raise? Mal asked Nikolai. all told, we could probably rally a force of roughly 5,000. They're spread throughout the cells in the northwest, so the problem is mobilizing, but I think it can be done. We also have reason to suspect some of the militias may be loyal to us. There have been massive desertions from the base at Politsnaya and the northern and southern fronts. What about Soldat Sol? Asked Tolia. They'll fight. I know they would lay down their lives for Alina. They've done it before. But can we rely on the apparat? What exactly does he want? I think he wants to survive, I said. I doubt he'll risk a head-on confrontation with the Darkling unless he's sure of the outcome. So she winds up sending a message to the apparat. It's in code, and it's put in sort of this weird place. I am very curious what the deal is with the apparat, because, like, y'all know that I really was sort of hoping she would just execute him. It seems like it might have been a good thing that she didn't. But honestly, I just feel like replacing him with somebody that she could actually trust might have been the better move. I don't know. Maybe there's nobody that she could have trusted who would also have been believable in their, like, furious devotion to her, you know? So dawn was breaking by the time we finished hashing out the specifics of what we intended to do next. The Kingfisher had returned, and Nikolai sent it right back out again, with a refreshed crew and a warning addressed to Westbrovka's merchant council that the Darkling might be planning an attack. They also carried an invitation to meet with him and the Sun Summoner in neutral Kerch. I should mention, too, earlier on, when the Darkling tells her what his real name is, and she repeats it back to him, and he says for her to do it again. He says, like, again, a couple times. He really enjoys the fact that she's calling him by his actual name. I will tell you guys what, I really thought that this was going to turn out to be some, like, witchcraft shit, and that he was going to use the fact that she was saying his actual name as a way to trace her to wherever it was that she was hiding. I'm super glad that wasn't it, that it was purely about just his name. Because that was going to feel like, you know, that's not something that we've seen in these books. There's been a lot of, everybody has superpowers, and there has been a lot of, like, sort of open-ended questions about religions and gods and things. But it's never felt, like, magical in the sense that, you know, like Dresden Files, if people have your full name, that can be a problem for you. They can do things to you. I think I would have disliked that a great deal if we suddenly introduced that into the story. So personally, I'm really glad it didn't turn out to be that. But it was surprising to me that this dude, after all this, has seemed to suddenly put so much stock in the fact that she's, like, knows his actual name. There seemed to be a sort of sentimentality to it that I was like, is that really him? Does that feel, like, accurate to his character? I guess I just still don't really feel like I understand the Darkling very well. And I don't know if that's just me, if that's part of the way that she intentionally wrote him, that we're not supposed to get him. Because to a degree, you want your baddies to be a little bit inscrutable, I think, if you're going to have them be bad on this level. And by on this level, I mean, like, you could literally destroy the world. Perhaps with the Fold. So I don't know if that's just me, but I feel like he goes back and forth from seeming like sort of pathetic to being pure evil. And maybe that's just how people are. That's sort of a thing in the real world, I guess. There's a lot of people like that who have done horrific shit. And then when you actually meet them, they're just genuinely like sad, pathetic human beings. So I don't know. Maybe that's just it. So she goes to see Bagra, and she asks, did you know Moritsova? And Bagra at first is just like, get the fuck out of here. I don't want to talk about this. And she pushes and says, you told me once you hoped for redemption for your son. This may be my last chance to stop him. Ah, so you hope to save my son now. How forgiving of you. Alexander, I whispered. She stilled. His true name is Alexander. And if he takes this step, he'll be lost forever. We may all be. So she asks again, did you know him? And she says, as well as anyone did. And this is very startling. Like, Alina suspected, but this dude, reminder that they are living very long lives, these people. And so they have, it's like somebody telling me that they knew Queen Elizabeth I. It's just, she's not a real person to me. She is this distant, wild legend. I know that she was real. And I know that people have samples of her handwriting and the clothing she wore and paintings of her face. Like, all of that is out there. But she still doesn't feel like a real person. So if I met somebody who had been alive and was like, yo, that was my mom, it would just break my brain. I would not know what to fucking even say. And the story that she tells is so sad. So she says, I'll tell you the story, the one I used to tell a little boy with dark hair, a silent boy who rarely laughed, who listened more closely than I realized. Moritsova was the bonesmith, one of the greatest fabricators who ever lived, and a man who tested the very boundaries of Grisha power. But he was also just a man with a wife. She was I will never get this right. She was Otkazatsia, and though she loved him, she did not understand him. I should tell you that he loved her too. At least I think he did, but it was never enough to make him stop his work. It couldn't temper the need that drove him. This is the curse of Grisha power. You know the way of it, little saint. They spent over a year hunting the stag in Siberia, 2 years sailing the bone road in search of the sea whip. Great successes for the bonesmith. The first 2 phases of his grand scheme. But when his wife became pregnant, they settled in a small town, a place where he could continue his experiments and hatch his plans for which creature would become the third amplifier. So eventually, she says that he did healing. And at this point, Alina interrupts and she's like, I thought he was a fabricator. And she's like, he didn't subscribe to that. That whole idea that like you get one speciality that you focus on, not really the way he saw the world. And I'm always a big fan of that sort of approach. I'm trying to remember, there was another story I was reading, or maybe a show I watched, where everybody had like, their particular focus with their abilities. And eventually it became clear that like people had limited themselves in a way that wasn't actually how their magic worked. And people began to realize that they could do more if they just branch out a little bit more. Oh, you know what it was? It was the Cradle series. Oh my God, I'm such a dodo. I can't believe it. But yeah, in the Cradle series, they are all sort of like initially indoctrinated to believe as children that they have to choose a specific wheelhouse for their magic, basically. And spoilers, he eventually learns that's not how it works. Like, that's a really limited view, and most of the world doesn't believe that anymore, but this like kind of isolated area still does and teaches their kids that. So she says the townspeople viewed Moritsova and his family with a combination of pity and distrust. His wife wore rags, his child was rarely seen, her mother kept her to the house and fields around it. You see, this little girl had started to show her power early, and it was like nothing ever known. She could summon darkness. So I found that particularly saddening, the fact that, like, his wife wore rags. He basically completely neglected his family. And this is something that the whole concept of neglect, for me, is one of those things that it's very fraught. Because, I know people who have been subject to neglect by their parents. And it's such a horrific fate because you want to even be angry at your parent for doing it to you, but there's an element of like guilt over your anger because you feel almost like your parent didn't even know how badly they were fucking up. So it's not like somebody, if, for example, they beat you, you can step back and be like, they knew beating me was wrong. They knew they were hurting me. And I have the right to be angry at them for this. But neglect is such a murky, unfortunate, like, pitiful thing where sometimes it's not the parent's fault precisely. There are all kinds of things that can go into it. Mental illness is a major factor a lot of the time. It can just be as simple as like, what if your parent is disabled somehow? What if your parent suffers from horrific depression and they just cannot get it together? That happens. And so if you have anger toward them for the fact that they mistreated you, but you also know that they were grappling with things that they couldn't get treated for, it's hard to reconcile those things and accept, yeah, I'm right to be angry, and also feel like you're not being unfair to them, you know? So this, just like the aspect that happens here with Morozova is the fact that he's like a workaholic, basically, and obsessive. And this is another way that this can turn out. People who focus so much, because there's a difference between being a workaholic because you are sort of like constantly worried about not having enough and trying to prove yourself, and the kind of workaholic that is driven by the passion for what they do. And when someone is driven by a passion, you feel like by asking them to step away from it, you are asking them to sacrifice for you. You are making yourself into a chore that they have to deal with at the expense of what they would like to actually be doing. And that is not a great place to be. You never want to feel like, oh yes, this person would literally rather be doing anything other than earning money to clothe and feed me, you know? So it's just a really, this like, it was a small offhand thing about the fact that they wore rags, but for some reason, almost more than anything, that got to me in terms of understanding what her father must have been like and what her mother was saddled with and why she broke down in a way, because we don't know what happened to her mother. And that wound up being something distracting for me, where I was just wondering, is she out there? Like, she was a regular person. I imagine that she died. But what if she didn't? And Alina, you know, is even theorizing, like, what if I'm her, like, long-lost relation via either the mother who didn't die or perhaps the sister who didn't die? And that would make sense, because they are the opposites of one another. So my father was ready to leave to hunt the Firebird. I was just a little girl, but I begged him to take me along. I tried to make myself useful, but all I did was annoy him, and eventually he banned me from his workshop. And then one day, Morozova had to leave his workbench. He was drawn to the pasture behind his home by the sound of my mother's screams. So she tells a story about how she had just had one doll, one beautiful possession that her father had carved. And her mother made her give it to her sister because her sister was like throwing a tantrum. And as soon as her sister had it, she snapped its neck. And she lashed out at her sister with the cut and tore her in two without thinking about it. Like, I don't know that she had ever even used the cut before. It was just this moment of such rage. The villagers came running. They held my mother back so that she could not get at me. That in particular, I found saddening. Like, they hold her back because they assume that her mother is wrong about Bagra's guilt. They couldn't make sense of what she was saying. How could a little girl have done such a thing? So it's not that they were like, yeah, you did the thing, but as a mother, you shouldn't hurt your child. It was like, we don't think she had anything to do with this. That's impossible. And I really wonder what they all would have done if they had known what Bagra did. Because I feel like this shit would have gone way differently. So at this point, her father comes running up, and He saves her sister, who has, I remind you, been cut in half. Weak, wheezing, and scarred, but alive. It was too much. The villagers knew what death looked like. That child should have died. And maybe they were resentful, too. How many loved ones had they lost to illness or injury since Morozova had come to their town? How many could he have saved? Maybe it was not just horror or righteousness that drove them, but anger as well. They put him in chains, and my sister, a child who should have had the sense to stay dead. There was no one to defend my father, no one to speak on my sister's behalf. We'd lived on the outskirts of their lives and made no friends. They marched him to the river. My sister had to be carried. She had only just learned to walk and couldn't manage it with the chains. And she tells them about how, she tells Alina, they, shoved them off the bridge. They went under the water. And she sort of has an interesting reaction to this, which is basically like, I don't think that he died there, though, because he was one of the greatest fabricators who ever lived. That was just ordinary fucking steel. I have a really hard time believing that simple shit managed to kill him. You have to know how hard it would be to kill somebody with the kinds of skills that he had. So, I don't know what happened to him, and I don't know if my sister stayed alive, but I just don't buy that was the end of him. What did the villagers do to you? If they'd been wise, they would have thrown me in the river too. Instead, they drove my mother and me out of town and left us to the mercy of the woods. My mother was useless. She tore at her hair and wept until she made herself sick. Finally, she just lay down and wouldn't get up, no matter how I cried and called her name. I stayed with her as long as I could. I tried to make a fire to keep her warm, but I didn't know how. I was so hungry, eventually, I left and wandered until I came to a farm. They took me in and put together a search party, but I couldn't find the way back to her. For all I know, she starved to death on the forest floor. And she says that she kept her power hidden, and she, heard stories about witches and stuff, and she would follow them to find where Grisha were hiding, because they weren't out and powerful at the time. And eventually, she said she searched for the most powerful Grisha she could find in order to have a child. He was a heart-render, which I love that that's an actual ability in Grisha, but it really just comes across as he was a real heartbreaker. And she says, my son he began so well. We moved from place to place. We saw the way our people lived, the way they were mistrusted, the lives they were forced to eke out in secrecy and fear. He vowed that we would someday have a safe place, that Grisha power would be something to be valued and coveted, something our country would treasure. We would be Ravkins, not just Grisha. That dream was the seed of the Second Army. I gave him his pride. I burdened him with ambition, but the worst thing I did was try to protect him. I never wanted him to feel the way I had as a child, so I taught him that he had no equal, that he was destined to bow to no man. I wanted him to be hard, to be strong. I wanted the lesson my mother and father taught me, to rely on no one. That love, fragile and fickle and raw, was nothing compared to power. He was a brilliant boy. He learned too well. So I really liked that, because this is such a temptation so often when people are writing a villain and they want to talk about how they became the way they did. Personally, I'm a big fan of villains that don't necessarily have origins. It's a combination of reasons. I am, first of all, a big fan of being able to just completely invent headcanons as to their origins. That's a super fun pastime, and I love that sort of shit. But secondly, a lot of times it can make them feel less mysterious, and sometimes you just really want the mystery around a villain. We have this thing, in our modern age, where we want to humanize everybody. And I understand that impulse, but it's not always that interesting in the end. I think that it can be, but it has to be done really carefully. And it takes a kind of investment in telling that story that often isn't what the writer's actually interested in the end. And that will show that the writer only did it because they were like, well, I kind of had to tell you, but it's not really what I want to focus on. And it really, like, you get that vibe. But what often happens is that they will do the whole, hey, so it turns out that he could have been like a good person if only somebody had like loved him and cared for him, but he had no family, or the family he had was like super abusive or whatever. And instead what we have here is a kid that was wanted. His mother went out of her way to have him, despite not being married, not having a stable like place to raise him necessarily. She doesn't talk about like where she says that they moved from place to place, that they weren't trusted. But despite that, she wanted him in her life, and that she was trying to protect him and teach him how to be self-reliant, and not to be like, you know, it doesn't sound like she was like, I taught him to never love. It was more like, I taught him that love wasn't going to keep him alive, which is true. And it's very understandable why she would have taught him that after what she went through. And so instead of it just being as simple as bad childhood, it's more complicated. A childhood that was rough, for sure, but he did have somebody whom he loved that wanted the best for him and was trying to do right by him. And instead it was this societal shunning that he resented. It was an oppression that he has endured at this point, hundreds of years, right? Like, so that will get to you after a while. I mean, Lord knows how many folks out there have only lived several decades of oppression, and they are ready to get violent and deal with some shit because apparently nobody's going to do anything about it. So I guess I'll have to. It's really hard to be as angry as I want to be at somebody who watched for hundreds of years as people like them were targeted and systematically killed, depending on where you were. Like Fjerda, you know, we see in the Six of Crows series, we hear about like the fact that Grisha are actually crucified. You know, it's like a whole thing, or burned at the stake. So, you know, the attitude that he has about this is becoming a little bit more understandable. So this is when she says, put your hunger aside, Alina. Do what Morozova and my son could not, and give this up. You may not be able to survive the sacrifice that Merzost requires. You've tasted the power once and it almost killed you. I returned, and she finishes, years later, I returned to the village of my birth. I wasn't sure what I would find. My father's workshop was long gone, but his journals were there, tucked away in the same hidden niche in the old cellar. They'd built a church over it. And this is when Alina's like, well, if he did survive, what do you think happened to him? And she says, probably he took his own life, because that's how most Grisha of great power die. It's just difficult to kill them. They begin to just tire of watching everybody around them that they love die. They witness the rise and fall of kingdoms. It just becomes too much. You should warn your prince. If he really thinks a bullet will stop a Grisha with 3 amplifiers, he is much mistaken. And Alina's like, well, what kind of power do you think it would take? And Bagra's like, girl, I think we're going to find out. So then we move on to her going to this meteor shower. Nikolai comes and gathers her up. And this really got to me, you guys. So she has just left her like meeting with VOLCRA. Nikolai runs into her and is like, "Are you okay? You look like a mess." And she's like, "Nothing." And as she's heading up the stairs, there's this moment. And, you know, this is really like, for me, this is a departure because this, you know, romance stuff has been the weak point for me. But I felt this was so well written and so, it was such a beautiful little like glimpse of something that was what I wish more of the story was like for me, and it just never has really hit, but this did. We just started up the stairs when Mal came bounding down in the opposite direction. He was beaming, his face alight with excitement. That smile was like a bomb going off in my chest. It belonged to a Mal I'd thought had disappeared beneath the scars of this war. He caught sight of me and Nikolai, arms entwined. It took the briefest second for his face to stutter. He bowed and stepped aside for us to pass. So she goes upstairs. She sees this amazing meteor shower that everybody is like leaning back and watching through the glass ceiling. All at once, the pain in my chest was so bad it nearly bent me double, because this was what Mal had been coming to show me. Because that look, that open, eager, happy look had been for me. Because I would always be the first person he turned to when he saw something lovely, and I would do the same. Whether I was a saint or a queen or the most powerful Grisha who ever lived, I would always turn to him. I read a tweet day before yesterday, and this man posted, "My wife died like several years ago, and I have been okay, mostly, in the past couple years, and I made a plate of this beautiful, like, shrimp pasta with a wine sauce, and I was halfway through the plate, and I had to put down my fork and cry, because it was so good, and I just wanted so badly to share it with her. And I knew that she would love it." That's what it's about. When something amazing happens, who's the first person you want to tell? When anything is good, who do you want to share it with? That's how you know. And honestly, this is the first time in these books that I understood her and Mal. It really is. Everything else has felt so melodramatic and so forced. And this was such a singular, crisp, clear moment that I understood. I really got it. And it just broke my heart. It really did. You know, I'm not sure about what's going to happen to Nikolai. I don't know that she's going to wind up having to sacrifice her relationship to Mal for him, because now Nikolai's gone. But I was kind of about it, you know, simply because it just felt so realistic. People don't get to get married for love in situations like this when they hold these sorts of powers, whether that be supernatural power or otherwise. But this was the first time that I was like, oh man, her and Mal not getting to be together actually does suck. So I just really loved that. So Nikolai takes her aside at this point and is like, look, dude, I know that you are super into him, but I have to tell you something. Eventually, I'm going to ask you to marry me. And I'm going to have to get Mal reassigned. Because the thing is, you know how it has been for me, with everyone guessing that I'm not actually my father's son Turns out they were right. But even if they weren't, those rumors, like, followed me forever. I can't have somebody around casting a shadow over any children we wind up having together. It's just not, I don't want to put a kid through that. And I was like, you know what? That didn't occur to me, but that's a really good point. That would be very dangerous. So this is when he, like, almost kisses her. And she says, I thought that you weren't going to kiss me until, and he says, until you were thinking of me instead of trying to forget him. I love it when you quote me. He brushed his lips over mine once, briefly, then again. It was less a kiss than the promise of one. When you're ready, he said. Then he tucked my hand in his, and we stood together, watching the spill of stars streaking the sky. We might be happy in time. People fell in love every day. Genya and David, Tamar and Nadia. But were they happy? Would they stay that way? Maybe love was a superstition, a prayer we said to keep the truth of loneliness at bay. I tilted my head back. The stars looked like they were close together, when really they were millions of miles apart. In the end, maybe love just meant longing for something impossibly bright and forever out of reach. Bleak. Bleak. So, next chapter. They're getting ready to depart to get on their search for the Firebird. And they're all saying goodbye to one another. She hugs Mal goodbye. And there's this moment where she's standing and talking to Nikolai, and then it says, he never finished his sentence. A shadowed blur cut across my vision, and Nikolai was gone. I stood staring at the place where he'd been, then screamed as I felt claws close over my shoulders and my feet lifted from the floor. So, I'll tell you guys what, when she is looking at the place where he had been, I really thought he had just been sliced in half with the cut. I should have realized that the Darkling wasn't going to do something that simple. That sort of merciful, honestly. So this scene is really something, because I thought in the previous scene, when all of the meteor shower was happening, I actually sort of was waiting for something to happen then. I thought the meteor shower was going to turn out to be a harbinger of something going on that the Darkling was working on. And so I had like myself all keyed up waiting. And when it didn't happen, I fell into like a feeling of complacency in this chapter. So this attack caught me totally off guard. So at this point, they're wondering how the fuck the Darkling has found them. I saw a red shape suspended between two Nichivoya, their black claws sunk deeply into their captive's body. Sergei's face was chalky, his eyes wide and terrified, his lips moving in a silent prayer. And the Darkling tells her that Sergei betrayed her. And she's sitting there like, did he really? He'd been on edge since the battle at the little palace, but what if he'd been planning this all along? Maybe he'd just been trying to slip away during our fight with the militia. Maybe he'd let Genya's name drop deliberately. He'd been so ready to leave the spinning wheel. That's when I realized what Sergei was muttering. Not prayers, just one word over and over again. Safe, safe, safe. Spoilers, the Darkling tears him into pieces. It's honestly a blessing, in my opinion. Sergei, there was just nothing good was going to happen. It just put him out of his misery and let him die. Honestly, there was a big sense of relief for me, because I just felt like this poor dude has just been through too much. This is going to break him forever. He's never going to recover. And I just really, it's awful though, you know? So Nikolai gets tossed onto the terrace, and I caught a movement from the corner of my eye and saw two blots of shadow slip free of the Darkling's hands. They slithered over the lip of the balcony, undulating like serpents, heading directly toward us. I raised my hands and slashed out with the cut, obliterating one side of the terrace, but I was too slow. The shadows slithered lightning fast across the stone and darted into Nikolai's mouth. So they turn him into a VOLCRA. He looked down at the dark veins coursing over his torso, at the razor-sharp talons that had pushed from his blackened fingertips. He held out his hands as if pleading with me for an answer. "Nikolai," I cried. He turned in the air, wrenching himself away, and raced upward as if he could somehow outpace the need inside him, his black wings carrying him higher as he cut through the Nichevoya. He looked back once, and even from a distance I felt his anguish and confusion. Somehow, the fact that she says anguish and confusion makes it so much worse. That's always been what kind of got to me about owning pets and like animals, the fact that you can't explain to them what's happening and the confusion that they feel, which leads to such fear, and you just want to be able to tell them what's happening. And I don't know, that just like plucked at a particular heartstring for me. A sound came from me, something guttural, animal, a noise I didn't recognize. I raised my hands and brought the cut blazing down in two furious arcs. They struck the warring shapes that surrounded the Darkling, and I saw some burst apart into nothing, only to have others take their place. I didn't care. I struck him again and again. If I could knock the top off a mountain, surely my power was good for something in this battle. And at this point, all of a sudden, the Nichevoya go perfectly still. And Mal is like, "Did you do that?" Because everybody saw that she has the powers to like handle the, shadows in such a way that it's reminiscent. And she did not do it. VOLCRA is here. So Misha guides her to the edge of the balcony. And the Darkling keeps yelling at her basically like, "I'm not going to harm you. I'm not doing this. We're not doing this." To which she's like, "Yeah, I fucking know you're not gonna. I'm not gonna, like, that's why I still have hope for you, is because I know you won't." And a terrible suspicion crept into me. VOLCRA had given me the strength to fight, but she'd never told me to do it. The only thing she'd ever asked of me was to run. "VOLCRA," I began. "My hut, my fire, that sounds a pleasant thing, but I find the dark is the same wherever I am." "You earned those eyes," he said coldly, but I heard the hurt there too. "I did," she said with a sigh, "and more." Then, without warning, she slammed her hands together. Thunder boomed over the mountain, and darkness billowed from her palms like banners unfurling, twisting and curling around the Nichevoya. They shrieked and jittered, whirling in confusion. "Know that I loved you," she said to the Darkling. "Know that it was not enough." In a single movement, she shoved herself up onto the wall, and before I could draw breath to scream, she tipped forward and vanished over the ledge, trailing the Nichevoya behind her in a tangled skein of darkness. They tumbled past us in a rush, shrieking black waves that rolled over the terrace and plummeted down, drawn by the power she exuded. So, Alina turns to run. The heated floor was slippery with melted snow. The massive window of the spinning wheel had been shattered, and flurries gusted through the room. I saw fallen bodies, pockets of fighting. So they go to the hangar. Some of the Darkling's blue-robed squallers had tried to blockade the stairs. They hurled crates and furniture at us in mighty gusts of wind. I slashed out with the cut, smashing the crates to kindling before they could reach us, sending the squallers scattering. The worst was waiting in the hangar below. All semblance of order had broken down in the panic to get away from the Darkling soldiers. So people are all climbing onto the cables of these ships that are trying to leave. And eventually the Pelican, which is the first one that's trying to head out, just like takes off, and there's people hanging from the ropes and stuff that just like drop, to their deaths. So let's see. Zoya, Nadia, and Harsha were backed up against one of the hulls of the Bittern, using fire and wind to keep back a crowd of Grisha and Oprichniki. Tamar was on the deck. I was relieved to see Nevsky at her side, along with a few other soldiers from the 22nd. But behind them, Adric lay in a pool of blood. Genya knelt over him, tears streaming down her face as David stood above her with a rifle, firing down at the attacking crowd with precarious aim. Strigg was nowhere to be seen. Stig, sorry, not Strigg. So they finally get onto the Bittern, and they try and get moving. And it's just too heavy. There's too many of them. Nevsky grabbed my shoulder. "Survive," he said roughly. "Help him." "I will," I vowed. "The other barge—" He didn't stop to listen. Nevsky shouted, "For the 22nd!" He vaulted over the side, and the other soldiers followed without hesitation. They threw themselves into the mob. Tamar called the order, and we shot from the hangar. The Bittern plunged sickeningly from the ledge. Then the sails snapped into place, and we were rising. I looked back and caught one last glimpse of Nevsky, rifle at his shoulder, before he was swallowed by the crowd. And that is the end of chapter 11. Guys, I am so devastated about Nikolai. Like, I think that it's possible to bring him back from this, but I don't know. Like, part of me doesn't want that to be true. Simply not because I don't want Nikolai specifically back, because y'all know I do. It's more because I don't love when there's like a terrible fate that can befall you, and then we find out eventually that that can be totally undone. There are times where I am sort of hoping that that can happen, just because, for example, Jamie and I were covering I can't remember, I think it was like the Flatline was the name of the Doctor Who episode, and a bunch of people get turned into like two-dimensional images, basically, and I was hoping that that was something that could be undone, because otherwise it was so bleak to me that everybody who had been attacked by this thing was just dead and gone forever, and that seemed really harsh. But when we're dealing with a story like this, where it's a war, lots of people are dying, then I start to get a little bit more wishy-washy about it. And I'm like, well, it's not as bleak, because, like, in comparison to everything else, it feels like a little bit too much of a cheat if we can just find a way around this and get them out of it. And also, there can be times where like, for example, the whole thing with Snape and Voldemort, there's no good reason why Voldemort would not have just killed Snape with his wand. He just did it using a snake so that there would be one last moment of life left that Snape could use to give his memories to Harry, so we could find out the truth about what was going on with him. That's a little bit how I feel here, because when Nikolai gets turned and he flies away, I'd warned Nikolai of the Darkling's vengeance, but even I couldn't have foreseen the elegance of this, the perfect cruelty. Nikolai had made a fool of the Darkling, and now the Darkling had taken my polished, brilliant, noble prince and made him into a monster. Death would have been too kind. I'm not sure I buy that. I don't disagree that it's an elegant solution, but there is a part of me that's kind of like, it just feels like you just want to keep him alive to save him later. And I guess we'll have to see. I don't know. But I am really super sad about it, honestly. So that sucks. But I have to wrap. I'm at the end of my time. So thank you again very much to Joanna for commissioning this. I appreciate you. I hope that you guys are enjoying the coverage. And I hope to be able to, I think that there's one more episode that got booked, but after this so far, it looks like there's only one on the 13th. But there might be one that hasn't been entered yet, so keep an eye out for it. But we're nearing the end, but we haven't quite reached it yet. All right, everybody, thank you again, and until next time, toodaloo, motherfuckers.
That was an Unspoiled Network podcast.